My daughter said, "You're confused," so I transferred the title in perfect clarity. They say getting older brings peace, but no one talks about how it also brings silence, the kind that screams in empty kitchens and birthday mornings with no calls. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share, and if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep telling these stories that need to be heard. My name is Evelyn Grace Whitmore, and I'm 63 years old. I live in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street in suburban Chicago, where the autumn leaves crunch under your feet and neighbors still wave from their porches. At least, they used to wave at me. This morning, like every morning for the past 8 years since David passed, I made coffee in the same chipped blue mug he bought me for our 10th anniversary. The kitchen still smells faintly of his aftershave, even though I've scrubbed every surface 1,000 times. Some ghosts refuse to leave, and honestly, I'm grateful for the company. I was stirring cream into my coffee when my phone buzzed. A text from my daughter Jessica. "We need to talk. Coming over at 2 p.m. Not, "How are you, Mom?" Not, "Can we have lunch?" Just a demand wrapped in digital coldness. I should have known then what was coming. Jessica arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors David and I had installed ourselves 25 years ago. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her smile into something artificial. Behind her walked Bradley, her fiancé of 6 months. A man whose handshake felt like holding a dead fish and whose eyes never quite met yours when he spoke. He carried a leather briefcase that seemed too heavy for documents, too important for a casual visit. "Mom," Jessica said, not bothering to remove her shoes despite the house rule we'd maintained since she was 5. "We need to discuss your situation. My situation. As if my life had become a problem to be solved rather than a story still being written. I gestured toward the living room, where David's favorite recliner sat empty as always, worn smooth on the armrests from decades of his evening news routine. The throw pillows I'd embroidered during long winter nights when money was tight still decorated the couch, roses and daisies stitched with hope for a future that felt more certain then. Jessica perched on the edge of the sofa like she was afraid of catching something. Bradley placed his briefcase on my coffee table, the one I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago, sanding away years of water rings and crayon marks from Jessica's childhood art projects. "Mom, we're worried about you," Jessica began, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they've rehearsed difficult conversations. "Living alone in this big house, managing all these financial decisions by yourself, it's a lot for someone your age. Someone my age." As if 63 meant my brain had suddenly stopped functioning. As if the woman who'd balanced checkbooks while working 2 jobs and raising 2 children had somehow forgotten how to think. "I'm managing just fine," I replied, settling into David's chair out of habit. The leather creaked in familiar places, offering comfort Jessica's presence wasn't providing. Bradley leaned forward, his cologne overwhelming the gentle scent of the vanilla candles I'd lit that morning. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've been discussing your financial portfolio with some experts. There are concerns about your investment strategies, your estate planning, your long-term care preparations. Portfolio, estate planning, long-term care. Big words designed to make me feel small, confused, helpless. What Bradley means," Jessica interrupted, shooting him a look I recognized from her teenage years when she'd coach her friends through lies to their parents, "is that we want to help. We've found some wonderful assisted living facilities with excellent reputations. You could sell this house, use the equity for a comfortable apartment where people check on you regularly." The words hit me like ice water. Sell the house. The house where David and I had painted every room, where Jessica had taken her first steps across these same hardwood floors, where Ryan had built pillow forts during thunderstorms. The house where I'd hung Christmas stockings and birthday banners, where I'd cried into dish towels during the hardest years, and laughed until my sides hurt during the best ones. "I don't want to sell the house," I said quietly. Jessica's expression shifted, her professional mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "Mom, be realistic. You can't maintain this place forever. The property taxes alone are eating up your Social Security. And what happens when you can't climb those stairs anymore? When you fall and no one finds you for days? Fall and no one finds you for days. The fear every widow carries, spoken aloud like a curse she was casting. I have friends. I have Ryan. I have neighbors who... Ryan lives in Seattle. Jessica cut me off. He has his own family, his own responsibilities. You can't expect him to drop everything every time you need help. Bradley opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, pulling out a stack of papers thick enough to choke on. We've taken the liberty of researching some options. There's a lovely place called Golden Years Manor, just 20 minutes from Jessica's office. You'd have your own studio apartment, 3 meals a day, activities, medical staff on site. A studio apartment. After 40 years of marriage in a house with 4 bedrooms, a garden where I'd grown tomatoes and roses, a kitchen where I'd baked birthday cakes and holiday cookies for anyone who needed sweetness in their life. And the best part, Jessica added, her eyes brightening with the enthusiasm she'd once reserved for Christmas morning, is that we can help manage your finances, make sure everything is invested properly, that your money lasts as long as possible. There it was. The real reason for the business suit, the rehearsed speeches, the sudden concern for my well-being, my money, David's life insurance policy that I'd barely touched, living instead on Social Security, and the small pension from my 30 years as a school secretary, the savings account we'd built quarter by quarter, sacrificing vacations and restaurant meals so our children could have college funds and wedding money, the house that had appreciated steadily over the decades, representing not just shelter, but every sacrifice we'd made to build something lasting. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, watching Bradley's fingers drum against his briefcase, but I'm not ready to make any major changes right now. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mom, Jessica's voice carried a warning I hadn't heard since she was 16 and testing boundaries. You're not thinking clearly about this. You're being emotional instead of practical. Emotional. The word women my age hear when we dare to have opinions about our own lives, when we resist being managed like inconvenient problems requiring efficient solutions. You're being emotional instead of practical. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking out the warmth I'd tried to maintain in David's favorite room. I stared at my daughter, this polished stranger in an expensive suit, and felt something crack deep inside my chest. Emotional. Was I being emotional when I worked double shifts at the school district so Jessica could take dance lessons? When I sewed her prom dress by hand because we couldn't afford the one she wanted from Marshall Fields? When I sold my grandmother's wedding ring to pay for her college textbooks? Jessica, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Do you remember your senior year when you got mono? Her perfectly manicured fingers paused on the papers Bradley had spread across my coffee table. What does that have to do with anything? You were so sick you couldn't keep food down for 3 weeks. The doctor said you might not graduate on time. Do you remember what I did? I watched her face, searching for any flicker of the gratitude that used to live there. I took leave from work, unpaid leave, to sit by your bed. I made you ice chips every hour, bought that expensive ginger tea you could barely sip. I slept on the floor of your room for 2 months because you were afraid to be alone. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his cologne mixing with the vanilla candles to create something cloying and artificial. Mom, that was 20 years ago. I lost my Christmas bonus that year because of the unpaid leave. We couldn't afford Christmas presents, so I spent December evenings knitting scarves and mittens for you and Ryan. Do you still have that blue scarf with the silver threads? Jessica's jaw tightened. I don't see how this is relevant to your current financial situation, but I wasn't finished. The memories were pouring out now like water through a broken dam. When you married Tom, your first husband, I gave you my mother's pearl necklace for your wedding day, the one she wore when she married my father in 1942. You said it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. I could still picture her that morning, 28 years old and radiant, the pearls glowing against her ivory dress. She'd cried when I fastened the clasp, whispering that she'd treasure them forever. You pawned them 6 months later to pay for Tom's gambling debts. Never told me. I found out when I saw them in Murphy's pawn shop window while walking to the grocery store. The color drained from Jessica's face. Bradley's eyes darted between us like he was watching a tennis match he didn't understand. You never said anything, she whispered, because you were ashamed, Because your marriage was falling apart and you didn't know how to ask for help. So I went to Murphy's and bought them back. Paid twice what they were worth because he knew I'd pay anything to get them home. I stood up, my knees protesting after sitting too long, and walked to the mantel where a small wooden box sat between photos of happier times. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay my mother's pearls. "They're still here," I said, touching the smooth surface that had absorbed so many tears over the decades, waiting for a granddaughter who might understand their value someday. Jessica's professional composure was cracking now. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, a designer bag that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. "This is exactly what we're talking about," Bradley interjected, his voice taking on the patronizing tone men use when they think they're explaining reality to confused women. "You're making emotional decisions about money. Those pearls could be appraised, sold, invested properly to generate income for your retirement." I looked at him, really looked, taking in his soft hands that had never known manual labor, his perfect teeth that spoke of expensive orthodontics, his watch that gleamed with the confidence of someone who'd never counted coins for bus fare. "Tell me, Bradley," I said, settling back into David's chair. "What did you sacrifice to build your relationship with Jessica?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. We both contribute to our relationship. We're partners. Partners. That's interesting. When Jessica had her gallbladder surgery last year, who took time off work to drive her to appointments? Silence. When she was worried about the lump in her breast, the one that turned out to be benign, thank God, who held her hand in the waiting room for 6 hours? More silence. When her boss was making her life hell and she cried every night for 3 months, who listened to her fears and helped her find the courage to look for a new job? Bradley's perfect composure was slipping. Jessica stared at her hands, the diamond engagement ring catching the afternoon light streaming through windows I'd washed just that morning. "That's what mothers do," she mumbled. "Yes," I agreed. "That's what mothers do. We sacrifice. We give. We pour ourselves out like water, never expecting the pitcher to be refilled. But what happens, Jessica, when the well runs dry?" I thought about David then, how he'd understood this in ways Jessica never had. He'd worked construction for 37 years, his hands growing more calloused each season, his back aching from laying concrete and carrying lumber. But every Friday night, he'd come home with a small bouquet of daisies from the corner market, 50 cents when we could barely afford milk. "Your father knew," I continued, my voice growing softer. "He knew that love isn't just taking. It's recognizing when someone has given everything and finding ways to give back." Jessica's eyes were watery now, her mascara threatening to smudge. For a moment I saw my little girl again, the one who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares, who brought me dandelions she'd picked from the yard, who told me I was the prettiest mommy in the whole world. "I know you love me," I said. "But love and gratitude aren't the same thing, and respect, real respect, means trusting that I'm still capable of making decisions about my own life." Bradley cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional turn the conversation had taken. "Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, financial planning requires objectivity, professional management. These sentimental attachments to possessions and property can cloud judgment." The audacity of this man, this stranger who'd been in my daughter's life for 6 months, lecturing me about judgment. I'd managed household budgets when interest rates were 18% and groceries cost a fraction of today's prices. I'd navigated the maze of insurance claims when David was dying, fought with Medicare administrators who tried to deny coverage for his cancer treatments, made decisions about experimental therapies that cost more than our annual income. "Bradley," I said, my grandmother's steel finally showing through the polite veneer I'd maintained, "I've been making financial decisions since before you were born. I bought this house when the mortgage rate was 14%, and banks required a woman to have a male co-signer. I raised 2 children on a secretary's salary while putting myself through night school to earn my accounting certification." His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "I survived the recession of '82 when David was laid off for 8 months. We ate beans and rice every night, but we never missed a house payment. I learned to coupon before it was fashionable, grew vegetables to stretch our grocery budget, and made Jessica's clothes until she was old enough to be embarrassed by homemade dresses. Jessica's tears were flowing freely now, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. I'm not confused, and I'm not emotional. I'm experienced. There's a difference. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock David had inherited from his father, another family heirloom that Bradley would probably suggest selling for its investment potential. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice small and broken. "What do you want from us, Mom?" It was such a simple question, but it revealed everything wrong with our relationship. She'd assumed I wanted something from them, when all I'd ever wanted was for them to want something genuine from me. "I want you to visit because you miss me, not because you need something," I said. "I want you to ask about my day, my health, my feelings. I want you to remember that I'm still your mother, not just an asset to be managed." Bradley began shuffling papers back into his briefcase with barely concealed frustration. "We should go, Jess. Let your mother think about what we've discussed." But Jessica didn't move. She sat there crying silently, staring at the coffee table where she'd once done homework, while I helped her with math problems and spelling words. "I used to know you," she whispered. "I used to tell you everything." "You still can," I replied. "But you have to decide if you want a mother or a bank account, because I'm not interested in being both anymore. You have to decide if you want a mother or a bank account, because I'm not interested in being both anymore." The words hung between us like a bridge Jessica refused to cross. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her knuckles, and for a heartbeat I thought she might choose me, choose us, over whatever Bradley was whispering in her ear. Instead, she stood up, smoothing her skirt with the mechanical precision of someone reassembling their armor. "We'll talk when you're ready to be reasonable," she said, her voice returning to that cold, professional tone that made my chest ache. They left without saying goodbye. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of silence so complete it felt like drowning in air. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, fully charged and completely quiet. No good morning texts, no calls asking about my doctor's appointments. No photos of Jessica's growing belly. She was 4 months pregnant now, carrying my first grandchild, and I was learning about it through Ryan's occasional updates from Seattle. The silence was a special kind of cruelty. It said, "You are dispensable. You are forgettable. You only matter when we need something." I tried to fill the void with routine. Morning coffee in David's mug. Afternoon walks around the neighborhood where Mrs. Henderson from next door would wave from her garden. Evening news in his chair, though the world felt increasingly foreign without someone to share reactions with. But routines can't muffle the sound of your own heartbeat when it's the only company you have. Last Tuesday marked my 64th birthday. I woke up hoping for some acknowledgement. A card. A text. Even one of those generic Facebook posts Jessica used to share with crying laughing emojis. Nothing. I made myself pancakes for breakfast, using the recipe my mother had taught me 60 years ago. The kitchen filled with the scent of vanilla and butter. But there was no one to tell that I'd accidentally added too much baking powder, and they'd turned out fluffier than usual. No one to laugh with when I flipped one too enthusiastically and it landed on the floor. I ate alone at the table where we'd celebrated dozens of birthdays. The silence so heavy I could hear the refrigerator humming 3 rooms away. At 2 o'clock, my phone finally rang. "Happy birthday, Mom!" Ryan's voice carried across 2,000 miles like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you, sweetheart." I tried to keep the desperation out of my voice, but after 3 weeks of silence, even this simple connection felt like salvation. "I sent you something. Should arrive tomorrow. And Mom?" He paused, the way he always did when he was choosing words carefully. "Jessica's being stupid. You know that, right?" Stupid. Such a mild word for what felt like betrayal. "She's pregnant and stressed," I replied, because defending her had become such an ingrained habit I did it even when it hurt. "Bradley has strong opinions about—" "Bradley's a parasite." Ryan cut me off with the bluntness that made him an excellent emergency room doctor. "And Jessica's old enough to think for herself. You don't have to make excuses for people who treat you badly." After we hung up, I sat in David's chair and wondered when I'd become the kind of woman who apologized for other people's cruelty. When had I started believing that being a good mother meant accepting whatever scraps of affection my children were willing to offer? Thursday brought a perfect example of the casual dismissal that had become my new normal. I was at the grocery store, the same Jewel Osco where I'd shopped for 30 years, when I saw Jessica in the baby goods aisle. She was examining strollers with the intense focus she'd once reserved for college textbooks, her hand resting on her rounded belly. My heart leaped. Maybe the silent treatment was over. Maybe pregnancy hormones had softened her anger. Maybe she missed me. "Jessica," I called out, pushing my cart toward her with the eager energy of someone who'd been starving for connection. She looked up, and for a split second, her face lit up with genuine joy. "Mom!" Then she saw Bradley emerging from the formula aisle, and her expression shifted like a curtain dropping over a window. "Oh," she said, her voice cooling by degrees. Hi. Like I was a casual acquaintance she'd bumped into accidentally. "How are you feeling?" I asked, gesturing toward her belly. "You're really showing now. It's beautiful." A genuine smile flickered across her face before she remembered she was supposed to be angry. "I'm good. Tired, but good. We're picking out—" She caught herself, glanced at Bradley, then stopped talking entirely. "Picking out what?" I prompted gently. "Nothing important," Bradley interjected, positioning himself between us like a human wall. "We're running late for an appointment." An appointment? At 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, when every doctor's office in Chicago was closed. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime this week," I suggested, hating how desperate I sounded. "I'd love to hear about the pregnancy. See if you need anything." "We're fine," Jessica said quickly. "We have everything handled." Everything handled. Like pregnancy was a business transaction, rather than the miracle of bringing new life into the world. Like she didn't need her mother's experience, guidance, or support during one of life's most overwhelming transitions. They walked away without another word, leaving me standing next to a display of organic baby food, surrounded by other expectant families who were probably calling their mothers for advice about cribs and car seats and the 1,000 small decisions that make parenthood so wonderfully terrifying. I finished my shopping in a daze, mechanically selecting items from my carefully planned list: soup for one, bread for one, frozen dinners for the nights when cooking felt too lonely to bear. At the checkout, the teenage cashier, a girl with purple hair and kind eyes, looked at my groceries with the sort of gentle concern that made my throat tight. "You doing okay tonight, ma'am?" she asked. Such a simple question. Such unexpected kindness from a stranger. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied, because the truth was too complicated for a grocery store checkout line. But I wasn't fine. I was drowning in the silence of my own family. Friday brought the cruelest blow yet. I was sorting through mail when I found an envelope addressed in Jessica's familiar handwriting, the same careful script she'd used for thank you notes as a child, when I'd sit beside her at this same kitchen table, helping her remember to mention specific gifts and express genuine gratitude. My hands trembled as I opened it, hope blooming in my chest like spring flowers after a hard winter. Inside was a baby shower invitation. "Join us for a celebration of new life," it proclaimed in elegant script, surrounded by tiny booties and rattles. The date was set for Saturday afternoon at Bradley's parents' country club, the kind of exclusive venue where membership costs more than I'd earned in my best year at the school district. I should have been thrilled. My daughter was having a baby shower, and she wanted me there. But as I read the details, ice began forming in my veins. The invitation was addressed to the Whitmore family. Not Evelyn Whitmore, not grandma-to-be, just the family name, like I was an institution rather than a person. Worse, there was a note paper-clipped to the invitation, written in Bradley's aggressive handwriting. "Please bring the items circled in the enclosed registry. Monetary gifts should be in the form of checks made out to the Baby Morrison College Fund that we've established at First National Bank." I flipped through the registry printout with growing horror. Designer cribs that cost $3,000. Strollers that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. A rocking chair upholstered in Italian leather that was priced higher than some people's cars. Every item circled in red ink was the most expensive option available. They weren't inviting me to celebrate. They were invoicing me for attendance. The paper slipped from my fingers and scattered across the kitchen floor like snow. I stared at the mess, at the expensive dreams and calculated demands, and felt something fundamental break inside my chest. Was I used? The question hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and sending me stumbling backward until I hit the counter edge. Was I used? Had every holiday dinner I'd hosted been an opportunity for them to eat well without cooking? Had every birthday check I'd written been seen as an obligation rather than a gift? Had every middle-of-the-night phone call when Jessica needed emotional support been just free therapy from someone too foolish to charge? I thought about the wedding fund I'd started for Jessica when she was 12, adding $20 here and $50 there from my modest paycheck. She'd used every penny for her first wedding to Tom, then asked for more money 6 months later when the marriage fell apart. I thought about the down payment I'd helped her make on her condo, liquidating my emergency savings because she was so close to qualifying for a mortgage and just needed a small boost. She'd never paid me back, never even mentioned it again, like the $10,000 had simply materialized from nowhere. I thought about last Christmas, when I'd given her a beautiful cashmere scarf I'd saved for months to afford. She'd unwrapped it, said, "Thanks, Mom," and set it aside without trying it on. Later, I'd seen it listed on her Facebook Marketplace page for half what I'd paid. The truth crashed over me like a wave, cold and merciless and impossible to ignore. I wasn't Jessica's mother anymore. I was her ATM. I wasn't a person with feelings, opinions, or dignity. I was a resource to be managed, optimized, and eventually depleted. I sank into David's chair and cried, deep, silent sobs that shook my entire body. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it feels like drowning from the inside out. The grandfather clock chimed 6 times, marking another hour in a day that had shattered whatever illusions I'd been clinging to about my relationship with my daughter. When the tears finally stopped, I sat in the growing darkness and made a decision that would change everything. I walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers and pulled out my checkbook. With steady hands, I wrote a check for exactly $50. The cost of a thoughtful baby gift from a grandmother who lived on a fixed income. Then I sat down and wrote a letter. Dear Jessica, congratulations on your pregnancy. I'm excited to meet my grandchild. I've enclosed a gift for the baby shower. I chose the amount based on my budget, not your registry. I love you, but I'm no longer interested in participating in relationships where my value is measured in dollars. When you're ready to have a conversation about respect, mutual respect, I'll be here. Love, Mom. I sealed the envelope before I could change my mind, before guilt could convince me to add more zeros to the check or apologies to the letter. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The phone started ringing at 7:43 a.m. on Monday morning, barely 2 hours after the mail would have been delivered to Jessica's Lincoln Park townhouse. I was watering the African violets on my kitchen windowsill, David's mother's plants that had somehow survived 8 years of my questionable gardening skills. When the shrill sound cut through the peaceful morning air like a blade, I knew who it was before I answered. Mom? Jessica's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. What the hell is this supposed to mean? No greeting, no pretense of civility, just rage, pure and undiluted. Good morning, Jessica, I said calmly, setting down the watering can with deliberate precision. I assume you received my response to your shower invitation. $50? $50 for your first grandchild? Her voice climbed higher with each word, the way it used to when she was 6 years old and didn't get her way. Do you have any idea how insulting this is? I sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd helped her with homework for 12 years, where I'd listened to her teenage heartbreaks and celebrated her college acceptance letter. The irony wasn't lost on me. I gave what I could afford, I replied. I thought you'd appreciate the gesture. Gesture? The word came out like a curse. Mom, we registered for things we actually need. That rocking chair? It's an investment piece that will last for decades. The crib converts to a toddler bed, then a full-size bed. These aren't frivolous purchases. They're smart, long-term planning. Smart, long-term planning. As if I'd never raised children, never made financial decisions, never understood the difference between needs and wants. Jessica, I raised 2 children without a $3,000 crib. You slept in a hand-me-down from the church nursery that I painted white with whatever money I could scrape together. Ryan used it after you, and both of you turned out fine. That's not the point, she snapped. We're not living in poverty, Mom. We can afford nice things. We want our child to have the best. The best. Paid for by someone else, of course. And I want to give my grandchild something meaningful, I said. Love, time, stories about their family history. The same things I gave you. The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Bradley, no doubt, coaching her through this conversation like he coached her through everything else. When Jessica spoke again, her voice had shifted to the patronizing tone I'd learned to recognize and hate. Mom, we're trying to help you understand that relationships require investment. Emotional investment? Yes, but also financial investment. When people care about each other, they show it through meaningful gifts. Meaningful gifts, like the cashmere scarf she'd tried to sell online. So, my love isn't meaningful unless it comes with a check? I asked. That's not what I said? That's exactly what you said, Jessica. You just used prettier words. Another pause. More muffled conversation. Bradley thinks maybe you're having some cognitive issues? She said finally, her voice softer now, as if she were speaking to a child or a mentally ill person. Memory problems? Confusion about money? It might be time to talk to your doctor about... I hung up. My hands were shaking as I set the phone back in its cradle. But it wasn't from fear or confusion. It was from rage. Pure, clean rage that felt like electricity coursing through my veins. Cognitive issues. Memory problems. They were trying to paint me as mentally incompetent because I dared to set a boundary. The phone rang again immediately. Then again. Then again. I unplugged it from the wall. But Jessica wasn't finished with me. Oh no, she was just getting started. Tuesday brought a surprise visit from Father Miguel Santos from St. Catherine's, the church where I'd volunteered in the soup kitchen for 15 years. He stood on my front porch looking uncomfortable, his kind face creased with concern and something that looked suspiciously like pity. Evelyn, he said when I opened the door. May I come in? Jessica called me. She's worried about you. My heart sank. She'd called my priest. My priest, as if I were a wayward parishioner who needed intervention from higher authorities. Of course, Father, I said, stepping aside to let him enter. Though I'm not sure what Jessica told you. He settled into the chair across from David's recliner, declining my offer of coffee with the gentle politeness of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. She's concerned about your decision-making lately. She mentioned some concerning behaviors, isolation, unusual financial choices, resistance to family input. Unusual financial choices. Resistance to family input. Father, I said carefully, did Jessica mention that she and her fiancé visited me with legal documents, trying to convince me to sign over power of attorney? His eyebrows rose slightly. No, she didn't mention that. Did she tell you about the baby shower registry, where the cheapest item circled for me to buy costs more than my monthly grocery budget? She mentioned you seemed upset about the shower preparations. Of course she had. St. Jessica, worried about her mentally declining mother who couldn't understand the simple concept of giving appropriate gifts. Father, I've been a member of this parish for 37 years. In all that time, have I ever seemed confused or impaired to you? He studied my face with the careful attention of someone who counseled troubled families for a living. No, Evelyn. You've always been one of our most reliable volunteers. Sharp as a tack, as my grandmother would say. Then maybe, I said gently, Jessica's concerns have more to do with my bank account than my mental capacity. Father Miguel's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes. He'd seen this before, families torn apart by greed disguised as concern. I see, he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, is there anything I can do to help? Pray for wisdom, I replied. For all of us. He left with promises to keep me in his prayers. But I could see in his eyes that he understood the real situation. Jessica had overplayed her hand by involving the church. Instead of gaining an ally, she'd revealed her true motives to someone who knew me well enough to see through the manipulation. Wednesday brought the psychological warfare to a new level. I was returning from my morning walk when I saw Bradley's silver BMW parked in my driveway. My pulse quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. If they were escalating to surprise visits, it meant my boundary had hit its target. I found them in my backyard, examining the garden where David and I had spent countless summer evenings planting tomatoes and roses. Jessica was pointing at something while Bradley took notes on his phone. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice carrying across the yard with more authority than I'd felt in months. "This is private property." They turned, and I was struck by how different Jessica looked. Her face was harder somehow, her eyes cold in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of my own mother during her worst moments. "We're just looking around, Mom," she said with fake casualness, "making sure everything's being maintained properly. Making sure everything's being maintained properly, as if I were a tenant rather than the homeowner. "I didn't invite you in," I said, walking toward them with measured steps. "You're trespassing." Bradley stepped forward, his phone still in his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're concerned about the property condition. This fence needs repairs, the gutters need cleaning, and that tree by the garage is looking unstable. These are safety issues. Safety issues. Maintenance concerns." They were building a case for incompetence, documenting evidence that I couldn't properly care for my own home. "The fence has looked like that for 10 years, I replied. "The gutters were cleaned last month by Murphy's Service, and that tree was planted by my husband 40 years ago. It's perfectly healthy." "Mom," Jessica said, her voice taking on that syrupy sweet tone that used to precede punishment when she was a child. "We're just trying to help. You can't see these problems because you live here every day. Fresh eyes can spot issues you might miss." Fresh eyes. Like I'd suddenly gone blind along with losing my mind. "I want you to leave," I said firmly. "Both of you, now." Bradley's mask slipped slightly, revealing the calculating coldness underneath. "Evelyn, this hostility is exactly what we're concerned about. Mood swings, paranoia, aggressive behavior toward family members who are trying to help." Paranoia. Aggressive behavior. They were literally trying to gaslight me in my own backyard. "Get off my property," I said, my voice rising. "Now. Or I'm calling the police." "Mom!" Jessica's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine distress. "Why are you being like this? We love you. We're trying to protect you." For a moment, just a moment, I wavered. The pain in her voice sounded real, and 36 years of motherhood made me want to comfort her, to apologize for causing distress, to smooth over the conflict and restore peace. Then I remembered the legal documents, the baby shower invoice, the priest visit, the cognitive issues accusation. "Love doesn't feel like this, Jessica," I said quietly. "This isn't protection. It's control. And I won't be controlled anymore." They left, but not before Bradley made one final play. "We're documenting everything," he called over his shoulder as they walked toward his car. "The isolation, the paranoid accusations, the inability to maintain relationships. It's all going in the record." The record. As if my life were evidence in a legal case I didn't know I was fighting. That evening, as I sat in David's chair watching the sunset over the garden they'd tried to criticize, my phone rang. I'd plugged it back in, hoping Ryan might call. But it wasn't Ryan. "Grandma Evie?" The voice was small, tentative, achingly familiar. "Katie?" My heart leaped. Katie was Ryan's 10-year-old daughter, the grandchild who still remembered to send me hand-drawn birthday cards and called to tell me about school plays and lost teeth. "Daddy said I should call you," she said, her words rushed and nervous. "He said Aunt Jessica is being mean to you and that sometimes people need to know they're loved." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of a child who understood what the adults in my life had forgotten. "I love you too, sweetheart," I whispered. "More than you can possibly know." "Are you really sick in your brain like Aunt Jessica told Daddy?" The innocent question hit me like a physical blow. Jessica had poisoned even this. My relationship with my other grandchild, spreading lies to family members 2,000 miles away. "No, baby," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my cheeks. "My brain works just fine. Some people just don't like it when grandmas use their brains to make their own decisions." Katie giggled. the pure, joyful sound of a child who still believed the world made sense. "That's silly," she said. "Grown-ups are supposed to make their own decisions. That's what makes them grown-ups, out of the mouths of babes." After we said goodbye, I sat in the gathering darkness and felt something shift inside me. The rage was still there, but it was joined by something else. Clarity. They could document my behavior all they wanted. They could call priests and question my sanity and examine my gutters. But they couldn't take away my right to make choices about my own life. And tomorrow, I was going to make a choice that would change everything. Thursday morning, I woke up at 5:47 a.m. without an alarm clock, the same time I'd been waking up for 40 years, back when David needed his coffee before his construction crew arrived at the job site. But this morning felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, as if the house had exhaled a breath it had been holding for months. I made my coffee in David's chipped blue mug and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad I'd found in the drawer, where we used to keep Christmas cards and birthday wrapping paper. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Things I will no longer do." The pen felt heavy in my hand, loaded with years of accumulated resentment that I was finally ready to acknowledge. 1. I will not attend events where I am treated like an ATM rather than a guest. 2. I will not defend people who refuse to defend me. 3. I will not apologize for having boundaries. 4. I will not give money I cannot spare to people who have more than I do. 5. I will not allow anyone to question my mental capacity simply because they disagree with my decisions. Each line felt like removing a stone from my chest, until I could breathe more deeply than I had in months. At 9 a.m. sharp, I called Linda Barnes, the attorney who had handled David's will 8 years ago. Linda was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who wore sensible shoes and had the kind of direct manner that put nervous clients at ease. "Evelyn," she said when her secretary put me through, "it's been too long. How are you holding up?" "I'm ready to take control of my life," I said without preamble. "And I need your help to do it properly." There was a pause. Not of confusion, but of professional recognition. Linda had handled enough estate cases to know the difference between a social call and a legal emergency. "Can you be here at 11? She asked. "I'll be there." Linda's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house near downtown Naperville, the kind of place where lawyers who cared more about clients than billable hours chose to practice. The waiting room smelled like old books and fresh coffee, and the receptionist greeted me by name despite the fact that I hadn't been there in years. "Evelyn," Linda said, standing up from behind a desk covered with case files and family photos. "You look like a woman with a plan." "I am," I replied, settling into the comfortable chair across from her desk. "And I need to make sure it's legally bulletproof." For the next hour, I told Linda everything: the power of attorney attempt, the baby shower invoice, the accusations of mental incompetence, Bradley's documentation threats, Jessica's manipulation campaigns involving priests and family members. Linda took notes with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen family greed destroy relationships before, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed her understanding of exactly what I was facing. "They're building a case for guardianship," she said finally, setting down her pen and looking at me with the seriousness of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "The mental capacity questions, the documentation of concerning behaviors, the involvement of clergy as character witnesses. It's textbook preparation for claiming you're incapable of managing your own affairs." The words hit me like cold water, but instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of relief. At least now I knew what I was fighting. "What can we do?" I asked. Linda smiled, the fierce expression of a warrior lawyer who'd found a worthy cause. "We can make sure they never get the chance to try." She pulled out a thick folder and began explaining my options. A revocable living trust that would protect my assets while keeping me in complete control. Updated beneficiary designations that couldn't be challenged. A healthcare directive that specified exactly who could and couldn't make medical decisions if I ever became incapacitated. "Most importantly," she said, sliding a business card across the desk, "we're going to get you a complete mental health evaluation from Dr. Rebecca Chen. She's a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in competency evaluations. When, not if, Jessica and Bradley try to claim you're mentally unfit, we'll have professional documentation that proves otherwise. Dr. Chen's office was in a medical building that smelled like antiseptic and hope, filled with elderly patients who were fighting their own battles against families who'd decided they were too old to make decisions. The evaluation took 3 hours. Dr. Chen was a small woman with gentle eyes and the kind of thorough professionalism that inspired confidence. She tested my memory, my reasoning abilities, my understanding of financial concepts, my awareness of current events. Mrs. Whitmore, she said as we finished, you have the cognitive function of someone 20 years younger. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your understanding of complex financial and legal concepts is well above average for any age group. I felt tears of relief gathering in my eyes. So I'm not crazy for setting boundaries with my family? On the contrary, Dr. Chen replied with a slight smile. Establishing healthy boundaries is a sign of psychological wellness. The people who are pressuring you to eliminate those boundaries, they're the ones whose behavior raises concerns. That afternoon, I sat in Linda's office and signed documents that felt like declarations of independence. Every signature was an act of reclaiming my life, of asserting my right to exist as something more than a resource to be exploited. The trust document was particularly satisfying. It ensured that my assets would be protected and distributed according to my wishes, not the demands of people who saw me as an inconvenience to be managed. More importantly, it included specific language stating that any heir who challenged the trust or attempted to claim I was mentally incompetent would forfeit their inheritance entirely. It's called a no-contest clause, Linda explained. It ensures that if they try to fight you, they lose everything. Walking out of Linda's office, I felt taller than I had in months. The late afternoon sun seemed brighter, the autumn air crisper. I had documentation proving my mental capacity. I had legal protection for my assets. I had a plan, but most importantly, I had something I hadn't possessed in years. The absolute certainty that I was making my own choices about my own life. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I ordered pizza from Gino's, the deep dish Chicago classic that David and I used to share during Bears games, and ate it while watching a movie I'd wanted to see. I didn't check my phone for messages from Jessica. I didn't worry about whether my choices would upset anyone. I just enjoyed being alone with my thoughts and my decisions. The silence that had felt so oppressive for weeks now felt peaceful, liberating, like the difference between being ignored and choosing solitude. At 8 p.m., the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Mrs. Henderson from next door, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd made a decision about something important. "Evening, Evelyn," she said when I opened the door. "I brought you some of that tuna noodle casserole you liked at the church potluck last year." Mrs. Henderson was 78 years old, a widow who'd lost her husband 10 years ago and had been managing beautifully on her own ever since. She was also, I suspected, one of the wisest women in our neighborhood. "That's very kind of you, Margaret," I said, accepting the dish gratefully. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" She studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize significant moments when they occurred. "I think I would, yes." We sat in my living room, drinking coffee from my good china, the set David's mother had given us for our wedding that I'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed special enough. "I couldn't help but notice you've had some unusual visitors lately," Margaret said after we'd covered the weather and neighborhood gossip. "That young man with the expensive car seems to spend a lot of time examining your property." I should have been embarrassed that my family drama was visible to the neighbors. Instead, I felt grateful that someone was paying attention, that I wasn't as isolated as Jessica wanted me to believe. "My daughter and her fiancé are concerned about my ability to maintain the house," I said carefully. "They think I need help making decisions." Margaret set down her coffee cup with the precise care of someone who'd made an important decision. "Evelyn, I've been your neighbor for 15 years. I've watched you handle your husband's illness and death with more grace than most people half your age could manage. I've seen you maintain this house and garden beautifully. I've watched you help other neighbors through their own crises." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting mine with the intensity of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "In my experience, when adult children suddenly become concerned about their parents' decision-making abilities, It usually has more to do with inheritance than competence. The blunt honesty was exactly what I needed to hear. You think I'm making the right choice by standing up to them? I think, Margaret said slowly, that some people mistake kindness for weakness and generosity for stupidity, and I think it's never too late to teach them otherwise. After she left, I sat in David's chair and thought about the woman I'd been becoming over the past few months. Someone who apologized for existing, who questioned her own judgment, who allowed other people to define her worth. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who understood that love without respect isn't love at all. It's exploitation with a prettier name. I pulled out my phone and composed a text message to Ryan. I wanted you to know that I'm legally protecting myself from Jessica and Bradley's attempts to control my life. I have a lawyer, documentation of my mental capacity, and a plan. I'm not a victim anymore. I'm a woman who knows her worth. Thank you for always seeing me as a person rather than a bank account. I love you. His response came back within minutes. I'm proud of you, Mom. It's about time. Want me to fly out and stand with you when they realize what you've done? Not necessary, sweetheart. I've got this. And for the first time in months, I truly believed it. The next morning, I woke up at 5:47 a.m. and felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was called. Anticipation for the day ahead. I had choices to make, boundaries to maintain, and a life to reclaim, and I was ready for all of it. The explosion came on Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd signed the trust documents. I was in my garden, deadheading the late-season roses David had planted for our 20th anniversary, when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway with the violence of people who'd lost all pretense of civility. Jessica's voice carried across the yard before I could even see her, shrill, panicked, and angrier than I'd heard since she was 16 and caught sneaking out to meet boys I'd forbidden her to see. Mom, what the hell have you done? I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves with deliberate calm. Whatever had triggered this visit, I was ready for it. The legal documents in Linda's safe, Dr. Chen's evaluation in my file cabinet, and the absolute certainty that I'd done nothing wrong created an armor of confidence I hadn't worn in years. Jessica appeared around the corner of the house like a fury. Her face flushed and her designer workout clothes wrinkled as if she'd thrown them on in a hurry. Behind her, Bradley moved with the predatory grace of someone who'd come prepared for battle. Good morning, Jessica, I said, pulling off my gloves. You look upset. Upset? Her voice cracked with hysteria. Mom, the bank called. They said our access to your accounts has been revoked. The trust officer wants to schedule a meeting. What did you do? Ah. So they'd tried to access my money and discovered the new reality. I felt a small smile tug at the corners of my mouth. I protected my assets, I said simply. Something I should have done years ago. Bradley stepped forward, his usual smooth demeanor replaced by barely controlled rage. Evelyn, you can't just cut family out of financial decisions. Jessica is your next of kin. She has legal rights. Actually, I interrupted, enjoying the way his confident expression faltered. She doesn't. I'm mentally competent, legally entitled to manage my own affairs, and under no obligation to give anyone access to my money. You're being manipulated. Jessica's voice rose to a near shriek. Someone's gotten to you, that lawyer or some predatory financial advisor. This isn't you, Mom. You're not this cruel. Cruel. Because protecting my own interests was somehow an act of cruelty against people who wanted to exploit them. Jessica, I said, walking toward the back porch where I'd left my gardening tools. Sit down, both of you. We're going to have a conversation. And for once, you're going to listen instead of lecture. For a moment, I thought they might refuse. Bradley's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping, and Jessica looked like she was contemplating either fleeing or attacking. But something in my tone, perhaps the absolute absence of the apologetic uncertainty they'd grown accustomed to, made them comply. They perched on the edge of my patio chairs like birds ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. I settled into my favorite garden chair, the one David had built for me 30 years ago from cedar he'd salvaged from a construction job. From this position, I could see the entire backyard we'd created together. The rose bushes, the vegetable garden, the oak tree where we'd hung a swing for the grandchildren who used to visit. I want you to listen very carefully, I began, my voice steady and clear, because I'm only going to say this once. I know what you've been trying to do. Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand that somehow carried enough authority to stop her. I know about the guardianship research Bradley's been doing. Yes, I know about that. I know about the evidence you've been documenting about my supposed mental decline. I know about the financial advisors you've consulted about managing incompetent elderly assets. The color drained from both their faces, but I wasn't finished. I know that you called my priest hoping he'd support a competency challenge. I know that you've been telling other family members I'm losing my mind. I know that every gift you've asked for, every financial emergency you've brought to me, has been part of a pattern of exploitation that's been going on for years. Mom, that's not... Jessica started. I also know, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation, that you took out a loan against your condo using my name as a guarantor without telling me. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I was too confused to read the documents the bank sent? Jessica's face went white. Bradley suddenly found the garden stones very interesting to study. $28,000, Jessica. You forged my signature on loan documents, putting my house at risk if you default. That's not family financial planning. That's fraud. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Bradley's head snapped up, his eyes wide with what looked suspiciously like fear. We were going to tell you, Jessica said weakly. It was temporary. Just until Bradley's promotion comes through. Bradley doesn't have a promotion coming, I said calmly. I called his company. Very nice receptionist. She was happy to confirm that Bradley Morrison is not, in fact, employed by Premier Financial Services. He was fired 6 weeks ago for misappropriating client funds. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the wind chimes on Mrs. Henderson's porch 3 houses away. Jessica turned to look at Bradley with an expression of dawning horror. What is she talking about? Bradley's mask had completely fallen away now, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. She's lying. She's trying to turn you against me. Am I lying about the loan documents? I asked. Because I have copies. Linda Barnes, my attorney, has copies. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit will have copies if you force me to file charges. Bradley stood up so abruptly his chair tipped backward. You can't prove anything. And even if you could, Jessica signed those documents too. She's just as liable. No, I said, enjoying the way his confidence crumbled with each word. She's not. Because I've already reported the identity theft to the authorities, Jessica is listed as a victim of your fraud, not an accomplice. Assuming she chooses to remain a victim rather than an accomplice going forward, I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, taking in the expensive clothes bought with money she didn't have, the jewelry that probably came from credit cards maxed out in my name, the BMW in my driveway that was likely financed through more creative document manipulation. Jessica, you have a choice to make, I said gently. You can continue following this man who's been using both of us to fund his lifestyle, or you can start making decisions that protect your child's future instead of destroying it. My child? Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. What does my baby have to do with this? Everything, I said. Because right now, Bradley is facing federal fraud charges that could result in prison time. If you're married to him when that happens, your child grows up visiting daddy behind bars. If you're financially entangled with him, your child grows up in poverty while lawyers seize every asset you have. Bradley was backing toward the gate now, his eyes darting between Jessica and me like a cornered animal calculating escape routes. Jessica, don't listen to her, he said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of someone whose schemes were unraveling. She's a bitter old woman who can't stand to see you happy. She's jealous of what we have. What we have, built on lies, theft, and exploitation. What you have, I said, standing up from my chair with more dignity than I'd felt in months, is debt, fraud charges, and a baby on the way with a father who's going to prison. I walked to Jessica and knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in mine. Sweetheart, I know you think you love him, but love doesn't ask you to commit crimes. Love doesn't put your future at risk to pay for someone else's lifestyle. Love doesn't try to steal from your mother. Tears were streaming down her face now. cutting tracks through makeup that had probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought, he said you had so much money just sitting there, not doing anything. He said it was smart financial planning to leverage family assets. He made it sound like helping." "I know," I said softly. "People like Bradley are very good at making theft sound like financial advice." Bradley had reached the gate now, but instead of leaving, he turned back with the desperate fury of someone who'd lost everything and wanted to inflict maximum damage on his way out. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "Jessica, your mother is worth almost $2 million between the house, investments, and life insurance. $2 million that your baby will never see because she'd rather hoard it than help her own family. Is that the kind of grandmother you want for your child? $2 million. He'd been counting my money like it was already his. "Bradley," I said calmly, "you're trespassing on my property. You have 30 seconds to leave before I call the police." "Fine," he spat, pulling out his phone. "But don't think this is over. I have documentation of your mental instability, your paranoid behavior, your inability to maintain relationships. Any judge will see that you're not competent to manage this kind of wealth." I smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd worn in months. "You mean this documentation?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Copies of every lie you told about me, every forged document you filed, every fraudulent transaction you made, because Linda Barnes has been very thorough in building our case." I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a restraining order, Bradley. Stay away from me, stay away from my property, and stay away from my family. Violate it, and you'll be in jail before sunset." He stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language, then looked at Jessica with the desperate expression of someone whose last hope was slipping away. "Jess, you can't let her do this to us. Think about our future. Think about our baby." Jessica stood up slowly, her hands cradling her belly with protective instincts that were finally stronger than romantic delusions. "Our baby," she said quietly, "deserves better than a father who steals from her grandmother." Bradley's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this. Both of you. When you're living in some nursing home eating cat food, don't come crying to me." He stormed out, slamming the gate so hard it bounced open again, leaving Jessica and me alone in the garden where she'd once helped me plant marigolds and learned the difference between weeds and flowers. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, mother and daughter, separated by months of manipulation and lies, but still connected by bonds that fraud couldn't completely sever. "Mom," she said finally, her voice small and broken, "I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this." "We start," I said, pulling her into a hug that felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey, "by telling the truth. About everything." 3 months later, I stood in the arrivals terminal at O'Hare International Airport, holding a sign that read, "Adventure Seekers Tour Group," and feeling more alive than I had in years. The woman approaching me was 72, had silver hair cut in a stylish bob, and wore hiking boots that looked like they'd actually been used for hiking. Her name was Patricia Chen, Dr. Chen's aunt, as it turned out, and she was leading a group of 8 women on a 2-week tour of Ireland. "You must be Evelyn," she said, extending a firm handshake. "Rebecca told me you were looking for something completely different. Ireland in November isn't exactly tourist season, but it's perfect for people who want to see the real country." I hefted my new backpack, a purchase that had felt revolutionary after decades of overpacking for family vacations that revolved around everyone else's needs, and grinned. "I'm ready for real." The decision to book this trip had come exactly 6 weeks after Bradley's departure. On a Tuesday morning when I'd woken up and realized I had absolutely no obligations to anyone but myself. No family emergencies to manage, no financial crises to solve, no guilt trips to navigate. Just freedom, pure and simple. "Mom, are you sure about this?" Jessica had asked when I'd told her about the trip. She was 7 months pregnant now, living in my guest room while she sorted out the financial mess Bradley had left behind, and still adjusting to the reality of having a mother who made her own decisions. "Sweetheart," I'd replied, folding my new rain jacket into the suitcase I'd bought specifically for this adventure. "I've spent 40 years making sure everyone else was happy. I'm going to spend the next 40 years finding out what makes me happy. The relationship with Jessica was healing, slowly and carefully, like a bone that had been broken and needed time to knit back together properly. We'd started with honesty, painful, necessary honesty about years of accumulated resentment and disappointment. "I used you," she'd admitted during one of our evening conversations, her hands wrapped around a mug of the chamomile tea we'd shared throughout her difficult pregnancy. "I convinced myself it was family helping family, but I used you. I let Bradley convince me you had so much money that helping us wouldn't hurt you. I never thought about what it cost you to give." Those conversations had been harder than any legal battle with Bradley. They required Jessica to acknowledge that she'd stopped seeing me as a person with my own needs, and they required me to admit that I'd enabled the behavior by never setting boundaries. "I trained you to treat me like an ATM," I'd told her one night. "Every time you asked for money and I gave it without question, I taught you that my value was financial. I never showed you that I had other things to offer." But the healing had begun when Jessica started asking for those other things. Advice about pregnancy, help setting up a budget with her reduced income, stories about her childhood that she wanted to remember when her own daughter arrived. Most importantly, she'd started visiting without asking for anything at all, just showing up with takeout Chinese food and staying for conversation that had nothing to do with money or problems that needed solving. The Ireland trip was my declaration of independence from the woman I'd been, the one who waited for permission to want things, who put everyone else's dreams ahead of her own, who believed that self-sacrifice was the highest form of love. The woman boarding the plane to Dublin was someone different entirely. Our group stayed in small bed and breakfasts run by families who'd been welcoming travelers for generations. We hiked along the cliffs of Moher in November rain that felt like baptism, visited ancient stone circles that made my problems seem beautifully temporary, and spent evenings in pubs where musicians played songs that spoke of survival and renewal. In a small village called Dingle, I met a woman named Bridget who was 84 years old and had just opened her first art gallery. "I spent 60 years raising children and taking care of everyone else," she told me as we stood before her watercolor paintings of the Kerry landscape. "When my husband died, my children wanted me to move to a senior facility, sell the house, stop taking risks. Instead, I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in my life and started creating beauty." Her gallery was small but filled with light, her paintings luminous with the joy of someone who'd finally found her voice. "Age doesn't mean the end of becoming," she said, handing me a cup of tea that tasted like independence. "Sometimes it means the beginning." I bought one of her paintings, a seascape that captured the wild freedom of waves that answered to no one, and had it shipped home to my living room, where it would replace the family portrait that had always made me feel more like a supporting character than the star of my own life. The other women in our group were all in similar stages of reclaiming themselves. Margaret from Boston had left her controlling adult son's house to live in a senior community where she'd discovered a talent for pottery. Susan from Portland had used her divorce settlement to buy a food truck and was selling gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches to college students. Dorothy from Miami had learned to scuba dive at 71 and was planning a trip to Australia's Great Barrier Reef. We were all women who'd been dismissed, underestimated, or taken for granted, and we were all discovering that life's third act could be the best one yet. On our last night in Ireland, we gathered in a pub in the village of Killarney, raising pints of Guinness to toast our own courage. The musicians were playing a traditional song about resilience, and the fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows that seemed to celebrate every difficult choice that had brought us to this moment. "To second chances," Patricia said, raising her glass. "To first times," added Margaret, the potter from Boston. "To learning it's never too late to disappoint people who had the wrong expectations," I said, earning laughter and fierce nods of approval from women who understood exactly what I meant. When I returned to Chicago, I felt like I was seeing my own life through new eyes. The house looked smaller somehow, less like a shrine to the past and more like a comfortable base for future adventures. The garden needed attention, but not the desperate maintenance I'd once used to fill empty hours. It needed the loving care of someone who had plenty of other things to do, but chose to nurture growing things anyway. Jessica picked me up at the airport, her belly now so round she had to adjust the driver's seat to accommodate it. She hugged me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd missed me rather than someone who'd needed me, and the difference was more significant than I'd expected. "You look different," she said as we drove through Chicago traffic that seemed less overwhelming than it had before my trip. "Happier, more, I don't know, more yourself, more myself." As if I'd been playing a role for so long that even my daughter had forgotten who I really was underneath the costume of perpetual availability. "I remembered something in Ireland," I told her. "I remembered that I used to have opinions about things that had nothing to do with other people's problems. I used to read books because I enjoyed them, not because someone needed help with homework. I used to cook meals because I loved the process, not because people expected to be fed." We spent that evening in my kitchen, cooking dinner together while Jessica told me about the birthing classes she'd been attending, the nursery she was setting up in the spare room, the names she was considering for my granddaughter. "I want to name her Evelyn," she said as we sat down to eat the pasta primavera we'd made with vegetables from my garden. "After you, if that's okay?" The gesture touched me deeply, but it also reminded me of something important. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. But I want you to choose a name because you love it, not because you feel guilty about how you treated me." She smiled, the first completely relaxed expression I'd seen from her in months. "I love it because it represents strength, independence, the courage to stand up for yourself when everyone else thinks you should just be quiet and grateful for whatever scraps they're willing to give you." 2 weeks later, I got my first visitor who wasn't family. Margaret Henderson knocked on my door at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, holding a manila folder and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd made an important decision. "Evelyn," she said, settling into my living room with the familiarity of a genuine friend, "I have a proposition for you." The folder contained newspaper clippings about senior housing developments that were designed as communities rather than warehouses, places where residents maintained independence while having access to support services. But Margaret's proposal was more specific than that. "There's a building downtown," she said, pulling out architectural plans and financial projections. 8 units, being converted to condominiums specifically for women over 60 who want to live independently but not alone. Shared common areas, but private spaces. No rules about visitors or cooking or when you can come and go. Just community without control. The idea was intriguing, but Margaret wasn't finished. "I've talked to 5 other women in the neighborhood who are interested. We'd own our individual units but share resources, a communal garden, a workshop space, a library. We could support each other without surrendering our autonomy." It was everything the senior facility Jessica and Bradley had suggested wasn't. Community chosen rather than imposed. Independence enhanced rather than eliminated. Friendship based on mutual respect rather than paternalistic care. "I'm in," I said without hesitation. The decision felt as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the change of seasons. I was ready for the next chapter of my life, one where I'd be surrounded by women who understood that growing older meant growing into yourself rather than shrinking away from the world. Baby Evelyn Grace Morrison arrived on a snowy Tuesday in February, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces and possessing the strongest lungs anyone in the maternity ward had heard in months. I held her for the first time in the hospital room where Jessica lay exhausted but radiant, and felt something in my chest expand with a love that was entirely different from the anxious devotion I'd given her mother. This love was free of expectation, uncomplicated by history, pure in its simplicity. I would love this child without keeping score, without needing anything in return, without using my affection as leverage for future behavior. "She's perfect," I whispered, touching her tiny fist with my finger, and watching her grip it with the instinctive trust of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world could be disappointing. "She's going to know her grandmother," Jessica said, her voice thick with tears that seemed to wash away the last of the resentment between us. "Really know her, not just as someone who gives things, but as someone who does things, who has adventures, who makes her own choices." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the manipulative woman who'd tried to control my finances, but the scared girl who'd been taught that love was transactional and had taken 36 years to learn otherwise. "She's going to know both of us," I replied. "The real versions." As I prepared to leave the hospital that evening, Jessica caught my hand. "Mom," she said, "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything else after everything I put you through, but would you teach me how to be like you? Like me? Strong, independent, brave enough to disappoint people when it's necessary. I want my daughter to grow up knowing she doesn't have to choose between loving people and respecting herself." I squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses she'd developed from her new job as a bookkeeper. Honest work that paid less than Bradley's schemes, but allowed her to sleep without guilt. "Sweetheart," I said, "you already know how. You just forgot for a while." We all do sometimes. Walking out of the hospital into the crisp February night, I felt complete in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I had a relationship with my daughter based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. I had a granddaughter who would grow up knowing that women could be both loving and strong. I had plans for a new living arrangement that would provide community without sacrifice of independence. Most importantly, I had myself back. The woman who'd gotten lost somewhere between David's death and Jessica's demands, who'd forgotten that self-care wasn't selfish and that boundaries weren't barriers to love, but foundations for healthy relationships. The snow was falling softly as I drove home to my house, the house I would soon sell to people who would fill it with their own dreams and arguments and midnight feedings. I would take my favorite memories with me to the new condo downtown, leaving behind the woman who'd believed that her only value lay in what she could give to others. Tomorrow, I would start packing for the next adventure. 1 year later, I sat in the sunroom of my new downtown condo, watching 18-month-old Evelyn Grace toddle around the communal garden while her mother chased after her with the breathless joy of someone who'd learned to appreciate simple moments. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto Lake Michigan, where sailboats danced across water that sparkled like scattered diamonds. My Bridget painting hung on the wall beside me, that Irish seascape that had become my daily reminder that freedom was a choice, not a destination. Margaret Henderson lived 2 doors down now, and we'd developed a ritual of morning coffee on my balcony while we planned the day's activities. Today's agenda included a visit to the Art Institute, followed by lunch at a restaurant I'd never tried but wanted to explore simply because the menu looked interesting. At 65, I was discovering the radical pleasure of making decisions based on curiosity rather than obligation. "Gam, gam," little Evelyn squealed, pointing at something in the garden that had captured her attention. Probably the fountain where goldfish swam in lazy circles, unbothered by the small hands that tried to touch the water. Gam, gam. Jessica had suggested grandma, but somehow this little person had decided I was something more informal, more fun. I liked it. It felt like a name for someone who would teach her granddaughter to climb trees and ask questions, and never apologize for taking up space in the world. "She's got your stubborn streak," Jessica called out, laughing as little Evelyn ignored her attempts to redirect her away from the fountain. Yesterday she spent 20 minutes trying to put her shoes on the wrong feet, because she was convinced that was the right way. Stubborn. Once, that word had been used to criticize me, to suggest that my opinions were inconvenient obstacles to other people's plans. Now it sounded like a compliment, a recognition of the strength that had finally learned to protect itself. Jessica looked different these days. The expensive clothes had been replaced by practical outfits suitable for chasing a toddler. The manicured nails were shorter now, better adapted to the demands of motherhood and honest work. But most importantly, the calculating expression that had become so familiar during the Bradley years was gone, replaced by the genuine contentment of someone who'd learned to measure wealth in laughter rather than bank statements. "I got a call from Ryan yesterday," Jessica said, settling onto the bench beside me while keeping one eye on her daughter's exploration of the garden. "He wants to bring Katie and Michael for a visit next month." Katie specifically requested Grandma's new house and the place with the swimming pool. The swimming pool was part of the building's amenities, along with a fitness center, library, and workshop space where I'd recently taken up pottery. Margaret had been right about the benefits of community without control. We helped each other when help was needed, but nobody kept score or imposed obligations. "Ryan sounds happy," I said, remembering our last phone conversation when he'd told me about the promotion he'd earned at the hospital, the house he and his wife were buying. The way Katie had started calling me every Sunday just to chat about school and friends and the new book series she was reading. He said something interesting, Jessica continued, pulling little Evelyn onto her lap when the toddler finally wandered back from her fountain investigation. He said he's proud of how you stood up to me and Bradley. He said it taught him something about setting boundaries with people who take advantage of family relationships. Setting boundaries. A concept that had once seemed selfish, but had turned out to be the foundation of every healthy relationship in my life. Your brother always was the smart one, I said, earning a laugh from Jessica that held no trace of the bitterness that used to color any mention of Ryan's success. No, she said, bouncing little Evelyn on her knee until giggles filled the sunroom. He was just the one who learned faster. I needed more lessons before I figured it out. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lake and listening to the contented sounds of a child who felt safe enough to explore her world without fear. This was what peace felt like, not the absence of problems, but the presence of relationships built on mutual respect rather than exploitation. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Chen, my Irish tour guide who'd become a dear friend. She was organizing another adventure, this time to New Zealand, and wanted to know if I was interested in joining a group of women who were planning to hike the Milford Track. New Zealand. At 65, I was considering hiking in New Zealand. The woman I'd been 2 years ago would never have dreamed of such a thing. That woman had been too busy managing other people's crises, too convinced that her role was to be available rather than adventurous, too afraid of being selfish to realize that self-care wasn't selfish at all. You're smiling, Jessica observed. Good news? Patricia wants me to go hiking in New Zealand, I said, showing her the photos Patricia had attached. Mountain peaks reflected in pristine lakes, trails that wound through landscapes so beautiful they looked like paintings. Are you going to do it? There was no trace of the old Jessica in the question. No suggestion that I was too old or too fragile or too needed at home to pursue such adventures. I'm thinking about it, I replied, which was my new way of saying absolutely yes, while savoring the luxury of having choices to consider. You should go, Jessica said firmly. Mom, you've spent so many years taking care of everyone else. Now it's your turn to have adventures. Your turn. As if life were a game where everyone eventually got to play instead of just watching from the sidelines. That evening, after Jessica and little Evelyn had gone home to their apartment across town, a modest place that Jessica could afford on her bookkeeper's salary, furnished with items she'd chosen for their comfort rather than their impression value, I called Ryan in Seattle. Mom! His voice carried the warmth of someone who was genuinely happy to hear from me, rather than worried about what I might need. How's the urban living treating you? Like a liberation? I said, settling into my favorite reading chair with a cup of tea and the latest mystery novel I'd been enjoying. I wanted to ask you something, though. Do you think I'm being ridiculous, considering a hiking trip to New Zealand at my age? There was a pause, but not the kind that suggested he was searching for a polite way to discourage me. It was the pause of someone thinking seriously about an important question. Mom, he said finally, do you remember when I was 8 and wanted to build a treehouse in that oak in the backyard? Dad thought it was too ambitious, too dangerous for a kid my age. But you helped me anyway. You held the boards while I hammered, spotted me when I climbed, and celebrated with me when we finished. I did remember. David had been worried about broken bones and insurance liability, but I'd seen a little boy who needed to test his capabilities and discover what he was capable of building. You taught me that age is just a number, Ryan continued, and that the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. If you want to hike in New Zealand, you should hike in New Zealand. Life's too short to spend it playing it safe. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet condo and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman who apologized for existing, who measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others, who believed that love meant never saying no to anyone who claimed to need her. Tonight, I was a woman who owned her own space, made her own decisions, and had learned that the most loving thing you can sometimes do is refuse to enable someone else's destructive behavior. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been lonely nights when I'd questioned whether standing up for myself was worth the temporary loss of Jessica's affection. There had been moments of doubt when Bradley's accusations of selfishness echoed in my mind like a cruel mantra. But those difficult moments had led to this: a granddaughter who would grow up knowing that women could be both loving and strong, a daughter who'd learned that respect was more valuable than money, and a son who'd always understood that boundaries were expressions of love rather than barriers to it. Most importantly, I'd found myself again, the woman who'd gotten lost somewhere between David's death and other people's expectations, who'd forgotten that self-respect wasn't negotiable and that dignity wasn't a luxury item that only other people deserved. I walked to my bedroom, where I kept a small wooden box David had made for me during our early years together. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay my mother's pearls, the ones Jessica had pawned and I'd bought back, the ones that had represented so much pain and forgiveness and complicated love. Tomorrow I would call Jessica and ask if she'd like to have them now, not as an inheritance or obligation, but as a gift between women who'd learned to value each other's strength as much as each other's generosity. But tonight, I would research hiking boots and airplane tickets to New Zealand, planning an adventure that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs and everything to do with the simple joy of being alive in a body that had carried me through 65 years of challenges and was ready to carry me toward whatever came next. The lake outside my windows reflected the city lights like scattered stars. And somewhere in that constellation of possibilities, I could see the outline of the woman I was still becoming. She was braver than I'd imagined, kinder than I'd dared to hope, and strong enough to love people without losing herself in the process. She was exactly who I'd always been, underneath all the layers of other people's expectations. And she was just getting started. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to know that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Whether you're 65 or 35 or 85, you have the right to set boundaries, make choices, and refuse to be treated as anything less than the complete, complex, valuable person you are. Love doesn't require you to disappear. Family doesn't give anyone permission to exploit you, and choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where your worth was measured by what you could give rather than who you are? Have you ever had to choose between being loved and being respected? I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Sometimes just telling the truth can be the first step toward freedom. If this story spoke to you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be told, and they need to reach the people who need to hear them most. Someone out there is fighting the same battle I fought, and they need to know they're not alone. Until next time, remember, you are worth more than what you can give to others. You are worth respect, dignity, and the simple right to make your own choices about your own life. And that's not selfish. That's human.